Yeah, there's too much going on in the boulevards.
Good afternoon, everyone. If I can call this meeting to order, I want to welcome you all to this hearing of the Budget and Finance Committee for Monday, November 4th, 2013. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the Committee, and I'm joined by Council members Bonin, Kretz, and Blumenfield, and we are ready to begin. We have three closed session items are the first matters on the agenda, which I'd like to take first. But before we get to those, actually, members, I would recommend item number 6, our regular Office of Finance report relative to accounts receivable, as a consent matter, unless there's concerns or questions about that. And seeing none, that matter is approved on consent. If anybody would like to offer general public comment about a matter within the jurisdiction of this committee or comment about one of the specific agenda items on today's agenda, please fill out a white card and bring it forward. So far, we've received no comment cards, and so I'm going to, seeing nobody waving their hands right now.
Sure,
yes,
I did have one question on the finance report. It's a very minor question, but I didn't know why interest rate was on some departments and not on others, and I'm curious about that answer.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what, then. Let's do this. Let's go ahead and take item 6 out of order. So first we have to...
Only a 2-second answer.
That's okay. We have to, I guess, formally speaking, we have to reconsider item 6. I'll move to reconsider. Seeing no objection, we will reconsider it. And go ahead, Mr. Bloomfield. Welcome.
Everything looked great. It's just a basic question. I didn't understand why there's interest rates on some departments and not on others in terms of those.
Good afternoon. Edwin Evanes, Office of Finance. The reason why there is interest on some and not others, there are ordinances for particular departments within the City Municipal Code and Admin Code that allow for interest. Not every department has that in place.
Right. Monique Earle, Revenue Manager. We are working with the various departments on interest and penalty. That is something that the Inspector General has highlighted in his most recent review. The Office of Finance has also been diligent over the years in advising departments in our citywide collection guidelines of the importance of applying interest and penalty across the board. But that is something that you'll see moving forward more aggressively along with our work with the Inspector General.
There's inconsistency with regard to penalties as well, and I think that also is going to be part of the continuing recommendations of the Inspector General for more consistency.
Great. Well, then I won't ask any more about it. I look forward to seeing what those suggested reforms are, because it does seem to make sense to have some more consistency there.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chair.
And so we receive and file that report? Thank you very much. So that brings us then to our closed session items, and having received no cards on those matters, I'm going to close public comment on items 1, 2, and 3, and we will retire to closed session now on those matters. So we'll be back in a moment. All right, thank you for your patience, everyone. We are back now in open session, and for the record, Mr. Englander was with us throughout closed session as well. So we will proceed now to item number 4.
Item number 4 is Department of Neighborhood Empowerment and Board of Neighborhood Commissioners reports relative to recommendations for a neighborhood council system, grievance system, and associated policies and processes. On October 15th, 2013, the Education Neighborhoods Committee approved as amended to the request that the City Attorney draft an ordinance.
Ms. Liu?
Good afternoon, council members. Gracie Liu, General Manager for the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. This council file is coming before you after a long process that began with Councilmember Krikorian, and I want to thank the council member for getting us started on this grievance policy that is much needed in the system. And we presented a report back in November 22nd, which presented a consolidated system with the grievances and the complaint system, which currently are two separate systems within the neighborhood council's system. And so we recommended back in 2011 to have one grievance, a little bit of a cold, to have one grievance panel that is comprised of peers, and that they would review any of the grievances that comes before the neighborhood councils. And it would help us to not only track the grievances, but also maintain records of them, because currently we don't have a way to track what the grievances that go to the neighborhood councils. And sometimes those grievances also don't go anywhere, which causes a lot of frustration with stakeholders, because they feel that the grievances are being decided by the neighborhood council about whom that they are grieving. So they wanted a neutral party, and we developed this peer grievance panel after months of working with neighborhood councils at that time. And then this recommendation sat for about a year, while the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners then took it upon themselves to try to change the plan of for a citywide system of neighborhood councils to address the same issue. They took this report and they presented it to their plan review committees, who agreed with the department in terms of consolidating the two systems. And so they have come forward and are now requesting, they brought it to the Education and Neighborhoods Committee, who passed it, and it's now coming before Budget and Finance.
Very good. Members, any questions on this one? Well, Mr. Blumenfield.
What are these complaints? What are they like? What is the nature of them?
Typically, in the current system, a grievance is about the board taking an action that is in violation of their bylaws or their standing rules. So it's some operational issue. With complaints, we can get a variety of types of complaints that range from Brown Act violations to conflicts of interest.
It's going to get us a lot of more Brown Act kind of things.
Correct. And the neighborhood councils on the grievance level, actually, the Office of City Attorney has stated that they don't have jurisdiction to review Brown Act violations.
So you have the neighborhood councils reviewing Brown Act violations.
Well, the Office of the City Attorney has said that they can't do those types of reviews, so they typically come to the department as a complaint. So now we are going to try to consolidate this so the peer grievance panel will have the authority under a new ordinance to review such issues.
But it still ends up being peer meaning made up of other neighborhood council members.
Correct.
Reviewing a very technical issue of Brown. I wouldn't want to review Brown Act violations, and I've probably spent more time on the Brown Act than I care to. I don't know.
You should have spent more time on it when you were in Sacramento.
I really do. But that concerns me as a big liability problem or just a big mess that can happen. You get a bunch of folks who really aren't expert in the Brown Act but our peers deciding what they, I mean, it'd be great if we could do peer review of our Brown Act issues, and then we could decide how to do it. I don't see how that's going to work.
The Office of City Attorney, under this new system, would be working with this peer grievance panel. These folks would also be trained on these issues, and they would also not be from the same area of the neighborhood council that's being grieved about. They would be coming from a different area, so they would have no connection.
Right. I get how you can separate the conflict of
Yes.
issues because you have a big pool of folks and you get people from, we got a big city, it's a good advantage there. But I imagine a fair amount of these grievances are pretty technical in terms of conflict of interest and Brown Act. And so how do you, so I'm just sort of planting a flag that I'm concerned about how that's going to work. And I guess the other question is how do you then measure the effectiveness of this proposal?
Thank you for bringing that concern up. We are working with City Attorney to address these concerns and make sure that we don't end up with a bigger problem than what we currently have right now, which is really an ineffective system that doesn't really address grievances or the complaints on either side. So I think that when we looked at this in 2011, as well as recently reviewed it again, that we realized we did need a comprehensive system that would address these issues. And we think that with what we've proposed so far with the Office of the City Attorney as our partner, that we'll be able to address some of these problems.
That you're going to have the City Attorney address some of the problems?
Right, correct.
And I can see even getting a volunteer panel of attorneys to deal with the technical problems and then having the sort of conflict or the grievance issue decided by more of a peer group or something to that effect. But still, so is there a plan to measure the effectiveness of the new policy, or how is that going to roll out?
So we will assess the effectiveness, once we implement the program. It is a matter of trying to just get the program into place and then seeing after we review some of the grievances that do come through, whether or not it's causing us more problems than the system is supposed to actually fix. And one of the issues that we hope that's going to be addressed is the remedies and having some type of remedy for the grievance, because right now it just kind of dies with the neighborhood council. And I think that sometimes your offices hear a lot of these complaints is because these grievances are not going anywhere.
Is there, and I won't take any more of it, is there a way we put a timeline so that 30 days, 60 days, whatever people think is appropriate, that we get some sort of, review period?
Sure.
So that it's...
I'm happy to come back and report back after a 3 to 6 month period, just to make sure that we can actually assess the effectiveness of the grievance, peer grievance panels. And I think that you too will hear probably in your offices if it's not being effective. But we think that given the current situation, that this is something that we've needed actually from the start of the system. So I'm happy to definitely come back and let you know.
And on that score, in 6 months, you're going to be back here with Dunn's budget. And I think Mr. Englander's going to ask a question or two about the budgetary impacts of this.
Sure.
Maybe that's the appropriate time to come back to this committee and talk about the effectiveness of the grievance process, and maybe a more complete substantive policy report back to ENN. But I think certainly in the context of our budget analysis coming up, we would certainly want to have a close look at whether it's working effectively.
Maybe just to put a direction in that as part of that process, we have a report.
Yeah.
So it's not just sort of the oral, it's working okay, but we actually have a formal report about whether this is working.
I think that'd be fine. Mr. Englander.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Kukorian, as you were on this committee at one point and were dealing with this directly as well. And thank you very much. Certainly we've had our share of issues internally with neighborhood councils, having internal grievances, and I know you and the department has spent a great deal of time in trying to iron some of these out. According to the report, there are up to 50 of these a year. That's a lot. A lot of investigative work, a lot of information, trying to find out the facts. I'm not sure what kind of remedies are being discussed here. And I do have a question on, first and foremost, having a process, some kind of process is critically important. I don't know what that is. But just the idea that you're presenting some ideas is a solution towards hopefully coming up with a resolution or a process that may work. Because what we have now, it doesn't work, and there's not enough time in the day. But there needs to be some opportunity for these folks to if they have legitimate concerns, and not just Brown Act, but others that turn into complaints as well, have to be investigated. They are part of the city family, and not to talk about the great work of neighborhood councils or not, but some of them have issues and that have to be dealt with in an efficient manner. And so that brings the question a couple. One is, what kinds of resources are we talking about? I heard the word or terminology used as volunteer attorneys may be working on this. If we're going to open up a process that we're going to allow them to follow, and if it's volunteer in nature, where we've got volunteer attorneys or volunteer neighborhood councils sitting on these panels, I haven't heard exactly who's going to be sitting on these panels, they will still take some resources. And if we can't get the volunteers, then we'll have to look at adding additional staff and costs as well. So I'd like to see that come back with, and perhaps it's best through the budget discussions when this comes back, to figure out what we're looking at in terms of cost and staff time. And that would be one, to ensure that those resources are highlighted. The second thing is, would it make sense to bring this in as a pilot and say, rather than just say, okay, we're going to try this process, and then all of a sudden, if it doesn't work or needs to be adjusted or replaced with some other best practices, that could be done. So we say at random, you will take 25 or 50 that are pending over the last 2 or 3 years, and work through this process and report back on findings and to the proper committee and through your commission. Would that be something that could be tried, or take your sort of top 10 worst, if you will, and see how that goes and what needs to be adjusted to better get our arms around this? What would be your suggestion?
We could, well, let me address the resources first. When we looked at this, we looked at the volunteer panel being of neighborhood council folks from different regions who agree to be on the grievance panel. We also considered if the council members wanted to appoint somebody to be on that panel as well. This is something that we were open to having discussion with the council members. Excuse me, and having the city attorney there, as well as one staff that we identified as a project coordinator that would handle the administrative aspect of this, which means tracking the grievances, making sure it goes before a grievance panel in a timely manner, making sure the grievance panelists don't have a conflict of interest. So that's the type of resources we're looking at.
And what would be the disposition of the findings of a grievance panel? So they've convened, they've gone through their exercise, there's a remedy.
Yes.
What is that disposition?
So the remedy, depending on the type of remedy, typically the remedy would be, you would have to rehold that meeting, or that if it was a Brown Act type of violation, you would have to cure it by having the meeting again and discussing the items again. There could be something that becomes more serious where it's a funding matter, and their funds could be frozen. The department may have to put them into exhaustive efforts, where we would basically take over their operations. That tends to be something a little more serious.
Would this grievance panel, if you will, have the ability to make that decision, or would that simply be a recommendation to some other authority?
So they basically would be empowered to make that decision. I think that when we looked at these grievance panels, we wanted to make sure that the volunteers' time and efforts were honored and respected, so that they couldn't give this remedy or this final decision and then have it be appealed to somebody else and then to somebody else and somebody else. So they would be the final panel to make the determination, and then they would provide the remedy to the department, who would make sure that the neighborhood council executed that remedy.
Could it be appealed? Could that decision?
No, at this point, the way that it's presented, it's not appealed. It can't be appealed.
Specifically, what decision, though? Because
On the grievance, so whether or not a grievance had occurred and whether there needed to be a remedy for that grievance.
okay, but any sort of legal remedy that would come out of that would still have to be approved by the city attorney's office, for example.
Correct. The city attorney's office would be working with the grievance panel simultaneously, so that once the panel made the determination, it would be with the opinion of the city attorney rendered prior to that decision being made. And so on your second point on the pilot, we can try the pilot. It ends up being, a pretty comprehensive and big pilot if we were to do something like that, because we still have to recruit everybody, train everybody. So it's pretty big. So we're happy to try it that way. I think in the end we will likely still need resources to execute it effectively.
Yeah, the concern I'd have with that is that I think because most of the cost is in setting up a system, whether it's a 95 neighborhood council system or a 20 neighborhood council system, the same system has to pretty much be in place. So that's where the cost is. And I'd be a little wary of creating more inconsistency in a system that already has too much inconsistency in process-wise from one to the other. I don't know if we'd realize savings, and we might be creating greater chance for inconsistent results and inconsistent treatment among the various neighborhood councils.
What I was looking at more of, and I appreciate and understand that, from a perspective of creating a process and a system, which there are a lot of upfront costs and time and recruiting and training and going through, I'm assuming we go through conflict of interest and background to make sure that if we recruit a panelist, for example, from one neighborhood council, because we do have several people in the city that serve on multiple neighborhood councils, but they weren't also either at the time or at a previous time have any kind of conflict like that. So I assume some of that would go into it as well. But if it turns out that it just perhaps doesn't work, how do we tweak it or make changes to that? Or if we want to bring in an appeal process, for example, and we find that perhaps there are neighborhood councils, and then we have some examples of some that simply just unfortunately don't get along with another neighborhood council for various reasons, and they feel they perhaps are being targeted unfairly, and there's no appeal process, and all of a sudden all their minutes are overturned, and their funding, for example, that's been encumbered, is disencumbered because they don't feel that they were passed according to the Brown Act, and then since there's no rollover policy, they have now lost encumbered funds. I mean, it could create unintended consequences, and stopping that or making changes to it once it's already started, sort of my concern, only because I've seen, we've had some issues with certain neighborhood councils not getting along with each other and having some of these issues. So there are some members throughout the city that are certainly more vocal than others and organized, and some people just want to get involved in their own community and don't participate on a citywide level, and others, there are all types of extremes on every end, all mostly good, but just different interests. So that's why I was suggesting a pilot.
Yeah, and I think,
Not suggesting, but asking for input. I'm open.
I think it's true that any revision that we ever make to anything in the neighborhood council system is always sort of a work in progress, and we'll see how it works, and it's maybe subject to change just because it is a laboratory and you have 95 different neighborhoods and each one has different resources, abilities, weaknesses, strengths. And this particular policy has been developed over the course of 3 years, I think, and has pretty much consensus buy-in, I think, across the city. Isn't that true from the neighborhood councils themselves.
That's true. It did originate, this system did actually originate from neighbor council feedback. They basically came up with a system.
So the check and balance, I would say, would be we try it. If it turns out that we're all, dissatisfied with this and the neighborhood councils were wrong in their support of this, then that's subject to change through council action or through our budgetary action, to Mr. Blumenfield's point, when we do sort of some accountability checks through the budget process. So I would say either way, both of those, that belt and that suspenders, are both applied to this. And I think I might have actually misspoken earlier when I talked about your upcoming budget, because actually the implementation of this program realistically couldn't begin until the beginning of the next fiscal year, I assume, right?
To July 1st. I mean, we can start some of the basic work in terms of recruitment, but the full tracking and an online tracking system and having staffers support this, I believe it would be coming into the next budget fiscal year. Yeah.
So if we were to approve the recommendation or approve the report of the E&N committee with an effective date for the program to be July 1st, 2014, that would give you sufficient time for implementation, for preparation for implementation. And then during the course of your departmental budget discussions with us, we'll have a greater opportunity to weigh in on cost after you've made a more careful analysis of likely cost for the year. And we'll have kind of a second bite at the apple, I assume, when it comes time to discussion of your budget.
Yes, I believe you will.
Okay. Mr. Blumenfield.
Of the complaints that we've had over the last several years, have any of them resulted in a lawsuit against the city?
No, not that. I don't have that information, but from what I can double check for you, but from my understanding, no, that we haven't had any complaints that resulted in lawsuits.
Is there any reason to think that, maybe just because we just spent 3, closed session lawsuits, I'm always hearing about those in this committee, any reason to think that this new system where we're actually dispensing formally with these grievances is going to increase our liability as a city?
I don't think that it will. I would have to talk with city attorney, though, to see how they feel about it, because they did look at the system, and I think that, if anything, right now we would have a higher chance of having a lawsuit filed against us for grievances that are not being handled at all than actually having a system that is...
Well, that would be good to feel like we're limiting our liability.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it gives kind of an opportunity for a mediation or an arbitration to resolve these things short of the full-on confrontation of litigation. We hope, if it works the way we hope.
So you're going both ways.
Yeah. Any other questions, Mr. Bonner?
Yeah, I have a question about the rationale or the justification for the regional system. I think it was Mr. Krikorian who was talking about how, creating a system, whether it's citywide or regional, is going to have costs and effort and personnel behind it. Is there a fairly even distribution of grievances throughout the city that justifies having regional systems?
They do come from all parts of the city. Actually, there's a few serial grievers in your council district that.
Oh, I'm sure.
a lot of these grievances, but they do come pretty much citywide, and that's why we wanted to make sure that we would have a big enough pool of volunteers so that we would never be stuck in a position where we would blow a timeline for a grievance just because we couldn't find a volunteer that didn't possibly have a conflict of interest.
And so I can understand that. Does it make sense to do it regionally, though, or would it make more sense to look at doing it by subject matter?
That's just interesting. I don't think they took that up. I think they were just looking at having things going across the region. But I can definitely bring that up. I think moving this forward would just be to have city attorney start preparing the ordinance language to give the authority to the panels. But we can definitely make an adjustment because the plan won't go into that much detail, but we can make an adjustment to look at specific subject matter as well.
I mean, the reason I ask is if one of the concerns is consistency,
Yeah.
you could have a West LA or a West Side one and a Harbor one that comes to various different conclusions on Brown Act grievances. Whereas if you had a panel that just did Brown Act and another one that did financial impropriety or something like that, then you get more of a consistent standard.
That's actually a good point, Councilmember, and I think that when the neighbor councils were considering this program, they did want to have a sort of case law be available to all of the panels of any grievance that was similar to this and what the final outcome and remedy was, so that they would have that type of consistency that you're talking about.
Thanks.
Yep. Anything further? Okay. Then my recommendation, members, would be to concur in the Education and Neighborhoods report and approve the recommendations of Dunn and Bonk, and instruct Dunn to make the system operational on July 1st of 2014 and to bring back further reports regarding the necessary budget impacts, positive or negative, or both, of this program during our budget discussions of Dunn's budget for this coming year. Anything further? Okay. Without objection, that'll be the action of the committee.
Thank you,
very
council
much.
members.
Thanks for your good work on this.
Thank you as
Over
well.
a long period of time. All right, that brings us to item number 5.
Item number 5 is the City Administrative Officer report relative to the Inspector General's review of the Collections Board of Review write-off considerations and focus areas to improve debt collection, including the sale of aged accounts receivables.
Mr. Campos, welcome.
Good afternoon. Pleasure to be here. Fernando Campos, Inspector General with the Office of the CAO's Office. The report before you is in response to a City Council motion that was approved nearly a year ago regarding the Collections Board review and the write-off process. In addition to that, it's an opportunity for the City to seek other opportunities of the write-off process in ways that we can increase our revenues. This report also supplements in response to one recommendation by the Commission on Revenue Efficiency, recommendation number 27, that requests this position or the Inspector General to review the Collections Board review and also consider the opportunity to sell debt or sell the age receivable accounts into the third market. And last but not least, also respond to several public comments that have been made over the last several years in terms of what are we writing off, how are we writing off, what accounts are we writing off, and can we do anything with these accounts after post-write-off. For those that aren't familiar with the Collections Board review, that the Collections Board review was created several years ago as a administrative mechanism to consider and review write-off requests by departments and also make recommendations to your council in terms of writing off these accounts from the financial records from the city. Simply by writing off these accounts doesn't mean that we can no longer pursue collections or actually collect on these accounts. It is more an administrative function and accounting treatment of the accounts, removing them from the city records. A couple of highlights that the report indicates. The review period was a 5-year period from January 2008 through December 2012. There was approximately 23 meetings that were held by the Collections Board review, totaling about $733 million in total write-offs. About 3.3 million accounts represent the entire write-off account, and about 90% of those accounts were from the Department of Transportation and also the Los Angeles Fire Department. Many accounts were approved for write-off because they were past the statute of limitation. And I want to make one thing clear, that those accounts were written off at that time are no more collectible then than that they would have been today. Many accounts that were written off were back from the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, so accounts that were sitting in our records for more than 20, 30 years. So this was a big effort on the city's part, not only to clean up the accounts, but also write off the accounts that were no longer likely to be collected. I am pleased to announce that the city as a whole has tremendously improved in terms of writing off these accounts. Many departments are now about 5 years behind. Majority of them are about 2 years, which is right above the statute of limitation. The department that's about 5 years and 3 months is the Department of Transportation, simply because the parking citations are allowed to be collected up to 5 years. So they are moving forward with that. There was a major push about 2 years ago to write off the accounts, about $180 million of the 733. And that was a request done by the Controller's Office audit, and that was a response from the Department of Transportation to clean up those books. Overall, the Collections Board review process is aligned to applicable administrative and municipal codes. There has been an improvement in terms of a 40% reduction in the number of write-offs that have been submitted to the council for your consideration, 14% decrease in the amount reviewed by City Council, and 40% decrease in the number of accounts reviewed by City Council. So this indicates to me that there has been improvements in terms of the write-off process, how fast the accounts move through the process, and how effective your council is in terms of writing off these accounts. So congratulations on those findings. There are some improvements that are being recommended in this report. First is looking at validating the customer operating status. Many accounts that were written off over the last 5 years were for customers that are still operating within the city or still operating in the state of California. Due to our technology and also dated technology that we have, many departments are not verifying the operating status against the LA tax system. The LA tax system is a system that the Office of Finance provides to cities to verify if an account or a customer is still active in our business operating. Also, in addition to that, we do have the state of California's business portal that departments can actually verify whether the account is still active or the business is still active in the state of California. Because this process is very laborious, it's very time-consuming, many departments are not comparing the operating status. There is an opportunity for improvement if we ask our collection agencies to undergo this verification of operating status during their collection efforts and remedies. The Office of Finance has agreed to consider this recommendation and also requesting that the collection agencies look at the operating status before the accounts are recommended for write-off. So in the event that an account is open or a business is still operating within the city limits and we identify that they are the debtor and we can still continue to pursue, then the idea is to have the outside collection agencies make sure that they have verified their operating status before they recommend that the account can be written off. In addition to that, the report does recommend, the major recommendation is to reassign income rights and also debt sale of accounts. What this means is that if post write-off, there's typically 7 steps in your collection process from the time that you provide the service to the time that you bill. You do pre-collection notifications, you designate the account to a collection agency, you manage the accounts, and then you do the administrative oversight of these accounts. That takes you to step number 6 in the collections life cycle, which is the write-off of the account. Post write-off, there is an opportunity for the city to take advantage, not only to monetize the debt, but also to sell the debt. The last time the city was moving forward, or the last time the city moved forward with a debt sale was back in 2009, in which we sold about $4.5 million in judgments. These accounts are good for about 10 years. Unfortunately, we received only 1 penny on the dollar for these accounts, about $45,000. We have not tried a debt sale since 2009. There were some lessons learned in that debt sale, and I believe that we can move forward in conducting another sale, a post write-off. My recommendation to you is that we need to...
Just if I can interrupt you, that was on a sale of judgments on
only.
bad debts?
Correct. Wow. Correct. And these accounts are good for 10 years, so the likelihood or the amount that a debt buyer would pay would be typically about 10 to 15 cents on the dollar as opposed to 1 penny on the dollar. I'd like to remind this council that, or this committee, that this was the first debt sale that we tried in 2009. It was the first time moving forward with that. There were some bumps along the road, so there was lessons learned. However, we did not do anything with those lessons learned in terms of moving forward. Over the last 5 years, again, $733 million were written off, approximately $145 million per year. If we had just considered a debt sale of about 25 or even 50% of that amount, that would have netted about $1.5 million additional revenue for the city. That doesn't mean that we could have received more or less, but even if we got 1 penny on the dollar, we're looking around $300,000 to $400,000 in additional revenue. if we move forward with reassigning debt or monetizing the debt and also debt sale, the mechanism in which we move forward with that would be amending the Administrative Code 5.186. That section currently authorizes the Director of Finance to conduct these debt sales. However, it does not provide the flexibility to the Director of Finance to hire more than one debt buyer at a time. So it's pretty much a single sale transaction as opposed to brokering or multiple sale transactions. In addition to that, this administrative code does not allow us to monetize the debt or truly factor the receivable. There's various elements in terms of factoring the receivables. We can do invoice discounting. We could also do maturity discounting. We can also do advance payment. So monetizing the debt, basically what that means is that we would take the debt owed, for example, if it's $1,000, we would be able to monetize it and do monetize the asset first, sell it, transfer the income rights to a third-party broker for an X dollar amount, i.e. $100 for the $1,000 account. We would receive that money up front as a prepayment or a maturity payment. At the end of 1 year or 2 years, depending on how the city would like to set the time schedule, that account would come back to the city, and then we would consider a debt sale after that. So then we can consider another revenue stream post the monetization. In order to do that, we would have to, again, amend the administrative code to just start the mechanism. So the report before you is making 6 different recommendations. First is to have the Office of Finance work with the collection agencies to look and validate operating statuses of businesses. The second recommendation is to amend the Administrative Code 5.186 that would allow the Director of Finance to look at different ways that we can monetize the asset and also conduct a debt sale. Third recommendation is to have the Department of Public Works, specifically the Bureau of Sanitation, to work with other cities' departments to look at ways that we can improve the collections in that department. Just to give you an idea, at the Bureau of Sanitation, we bill approximately 45,000 accounts per year, netting the city about $12 million in amounts billable. However, only about $11 million comes back in terms of paid amounts. So we're leaving about $1 million on the books every year in terms of amounts that can be collected. So that is an opportunity for us to close the gap and collect additional revenues for the Bureau of Sanitation.
Okay, Mr. Engler had a question.
Just a quick question on that.
Okay.
Since they don't do most of their billing, it's done through on the DWP bill. It says to work with the other departments, but how can they?
For the Bureau of Sanitation, the portion that I'm referring to is with attachment number 2, which talks about the sewer and wastewater billing system. So it's not the DWP bill; it's the amount that we bill directly for the inspections for sewer. So those
are inspections.
Inspections, correct. And this is in compliance with the Clean Water Act. So in many cases, we had
commercial properties.
Commercial properties, all commercial properties. So in many cases, we will continue to do our quarterly inspection as required by federal laws.
One day, we'll stump you. But today is not that day. Yes.
So in those cases, we continue to do our inspection as required by federal guidelines. So we will continue to bill. In some cases, we billed 11 years to one particular business. And so there ought to be a way that we look at closing that. There has to be a policy in that bureau to say after 5 years, if we attempted to collect, there ought to be some other mechanism. I'd like to move it closer to the 1 year mark as opposed to waiting 5 years non-collection. Recommendation number 4 is to instruct the Los Angeles Fire Department to look at the feasibility of requiring payment for fire safety officer watch services that are related to filming permits. Currently, about 90% of all our film permits go through Film LA, which is a third-party vendor that the city contracted for filming. However, there are special occasions in which the fire department will issue the permit and collect that revenue. Approximately 2,200 bills go out a year for these special occasions, which are for properties that are federal and state properties, state conservancies, and also studios that have been certified on a prepaid or bill direct basis. The good thing is that we bill about $1.3 million. The bad thing is that we collect about $1 million for these services, so we leave about $200,000 to $300,000 every year for fire safety watch services related to these 4 occasions. If we require or we review the feasibility of requiring the fire department to collect the fees up front as opposed to providing the service and then billing, we would be able to collect about $200,000 to $300,000 every year for the fire department. And last but not least, the recommendation is to have the Collections Board review some proposed Board of Review protocol changes. They were presented in July 2013 to the board. The board has not yet approved those, but I am requesting that they review, and they are currently doing so, and then adopting those as are deemed feasible. With that, thank you again for the time. I will open it up and answer any questions that you may have.
All right. Thank you very much. Members, anything further? Mr. Kretz.
First of all, on debt sale, why would we ever write anything off? Why wouldn't we try to engage in the debt sale of almost anything at some value?
Councilman Koretz, the main challenge for the city over the last several years has been just getting the accounts off the books. The accounts have been severely aged 20, 30 years. So I agree with you in terms of why would we ever sell a debt. We would try to, ultimately our goal is to collect everything up front. If we were to write off, if we continue the write-off process, we would be able to open up a new market, and that is the post-write-off collections market, in which we can monetize the sale and then also debt sell and get additional revenues. So this would be a one-time revenue for the city. In addition to that, if we monetize the assets, we could go into a profit sharing or revenue sharing agreement with a third-party vendor, i.e. if they gave us X amount of dollars up front for the transfer of the income rights, then we would be able to include in the contract or in the provisions of the contract that would allow us to share the profits after that dollar amount that has been received. So for example, if we sold $1 million to a third-party vendor that would be willing to monetize that asset and we received $100,000 up front, we would be able to include a profit-sharing provision that would indicate that if the third-party vendor were to collect $500,000 for that same portfolio, we would be able to get a piece of that profit or a piece of that additional revenue.
But what I'm not clear on is why we couldn't package all the old debts that we write off. Why couldn't we just sell them?
We could. There's
even the really bad ones that are 20 years old.
We can definitely do that if you'd like.
Batch of them?
We can definitely do that. However, because they're past statute of limitation in many accounts, they're 20, 30 years, the likelihood of us even getting one penny would be extremely low. There is a state bill that's coming up that's effective January 1st. It's State Bill 233 that would allow a debt buyer to buy the asset and also do collections post write-off. So in the post write-off world, the debt buyer would have to disclose to a potential debtor that the statute of limitation has passed, that they're trying to collect the debt, and that the debt collection cannot follow as a judgment or be sent to collection bureaus. So the debt buyer has to disclose to the debtor in terms of what they can and cannot do. So that's starting January 1st. The current laws prohibit us from going beyond the statute of limitations.
So that would have some positives and some negatives in terms of being able to collect.
We can scrub the list again. We can go through the $733 million, but about 50 or 60% of that is just past the statute of limitations. So likelihood of us getting one penny on the dollar will be extremely high at this point. But we can definitely look at the other 40% if you'd like.
And I know one of the things you were talking about was tracking, doing business with people who are owe us money and continue not to pay us. How do we not do that currently, and what's the real change that we're going to make to allow us to do that?
In terms of moving forward with those companies that are still operating with us but have not been paying, there are other remedies that we can look at. A controversial one would be turning off the water for those commercial individuals in which you are providing water services. We can also bill the amount unpaid with DWP, but again, those are opportunities that we would have to look to see whether they're feasible, whether they can actually be implemented or practical. So turning off the water service, for example, in the Bureau of Sanitation would be the ideal, so that we can stop the sewer disposal, but that's not going to be the most popular recommendation.
Well, I understand why you wouldn't do it with residential, but with businesses, I would think we should be using whatever means necessary if we're still dealing with them and they're still debtors.
So the recommendation before you is really to start looking at that question and answering what can we do with those scenarios in which the business is still in operation. We know we have to comply with federal laws, making sure that we're adhering to the federal laws, but at the same time collecting. So the next step for us is to start working with those departments and other city departments to figure out a way that we can close that gap.
And lastly, I like the idea of debt avoidance with film permits. It's obviously sort of like conservation. The debt that's the easiest to collect is the one that you don't have to collect because you've eliminated the opportunity for the debt. Are there other places in the city where we would have similar opportunities to avoid going into debt in the first place?
I'm actually working on a collection scorecard report that the Office of Finance previously mentioned with item number 4, I believe, or 6 on the agenda. And that report should be released within the next week or two. And that does address the issues of interest and penalties and also addresses the issue of prepayment for services. So ideally, if we can get everything on a prepayment basis, that would be the best way to avoid any collection remedies or collection being in the collection scenario. However, not all billing types will fit that profile. So I looked at 160 billing profiles. About 10 or 15% of those fit that prepayment standards, but not all of them will fit that scenario.
It's still a great opportunity for us as much as we
Absolutely.
can do it. So that's great.
Absolutely.
Be hard to do that with ambulance service, for example.
Correct.
Well, if they don't prepay, they just get stuck. I don't think so.
Mr. Blumenfield.
Yeah, a couple questions. You were saying that getting the operating status is very laborious. Why is that? It seems like it should be comparing 2 Excel spreadsheets or clicking into a database, but obviously there's more to it.
There's definitely more to it. So the departments that have the technology in place, they're able to verify the status through the LA Tax. What's happening and very difficult is that some departments will use something other than the BTRC as the unique indicator for the account. For example, the housing department uses APN numbers, accessor parcel numbers, and that doesn't fit in well in terms of interfacing or doing automated reconciliation. In other cases, departments will have to sign into the LA Tax system. The system is in a different server, so it takes a while for the information to pop up. In many cases, the search engine is very sensitive in terms of the name, how you spell it, whether it's all cap, lower cap, whether you put an asterisk for the wild card or not. So it does take some time for a individual or a staff member to actually verify whether they are active in the LA Tax system. The same thing happens with the State of California Business Portal. They would have to manually enter one business at a time. We're talking 3.3 million accounts that the city has written off over a 5-year period. So the recommendation is really to automate and streamline that process where we can have systems talking to each other and letting the systems do the checking and not the staffer.
Yeah, no, that would be the goal, and obviously it's going to happen at some point. The faster we can make that happen, the better off we'll be on that front, certainly. On the number 2 issue about the basically selling the debt, one of the things I mentioned in the previous hearing is I'm concerned about some of the predatory debt collection practices that are out there, and both from having heard about it in a hearing a number of months ago, but also having seen it was 60 Minutes or 2020, one of those shows where they did an expose and they have literally prisoners or convicts threatening old ladies, and I mean it's just some pretty terrible stuff that once you get down to the lowest element of the debt collection world, it's not the way we'd want our LA debts collected for, grandma owes a parking ticket and the city sells it and it gets resold 6 different times, and pretty soon you got a felon knocking on her door, shaking her down.
Right.
How do we, obviously it's an extreme example, but how do we put in some sort of protections, especially when we're getting 1 cent on the dollar, it's not worth it.
Right.
If it's going to get down to that level, so that we can put in some protections to avoid that kind of practice.
In terms of risk, the collection agencies that we currently have in our city's pool, which are 7 agencies, it's the same risk that currently happens with accounts that are in our active portfolio. So it's not just a debt sale issue, it's an active account issue as well. So you do have some deceptive practices that collection agencies will use. Our collection agencies that we do have indemnification clauses in our contracts that would indemnify us and hold us harmless in case there is some sort of allegation of federal violations or even the Fair Debt and Crediting the Fair Debt Collections Practices Act or even the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. So the same types of financial risk or even risk mitigation strategies can be implemented with the debt sale. So making sure that we have those types of clauses in our contracts when we sell that debt or even when we reassign that income rights to protect the city.
That helps. The liability issue doesn't necessarily help the moral issue, I guess, in terms of there's a way that we can put some sort of restrictive deed on our debt. I don't know how you would do it, but it's something that bugs me. I'm not sure how to address that, but I am concerned.
Yeah, that's a good point. One of the things that I can add to my notes here and just put it on my radar is to make sure that we can include some sort of governance or oversight of these collection agencies. So simply because we sell the debt or we monetize the debt and temporarily transfer our income rights doesn't mean that we don't have city staff overseeing that transaction from cradle to grave. So that's a good point.
Is there a way to also insert some sort of standards in, or are there standards out there that we could import in so that at least we have a clearer conscience on the debt that we're selling off that theoretically could be sold off 6 different times?
There are some standards in terms of federal and state laws that we can incorporate into the contract, but I will reach out to the American Credit and Collections Association to see if there's any benchmarks or any best practices that we can include.
Appreciate that. And then on the upfront things on the fire department, does Film LA have the same problem? You mentioned they do most of this and we have some of it. Do they collect upfront or do they have a similar ratio of non-payment?
No, they do not. They do collect up front. Their collection ratio right now is about 96, 98%. So there is some accounts that do fall outside of the collection agency. So in other words, if they provide a $1,000 deposit for the film, but the actual cost ends up being $1,200, we will balance bill for the difference. So that's where the delta is on the Film LA. On the fire safety watch that you have in front of you for the fire department, the average collection rate over a 5-year period has been 85%. So we have about a 15% delta. So there is a big difference between what we collect, what we bill in-house versus what we bill through the third-party vendor.
And last question is about, do we have any link with like Board of Equalization, or is there a way that we can get our debts collected by the BOE?
We do have interfaces or interlinks with them with the Franchise Tax Board as well. So we are working, for example, the Department of Transportation, the Fire Department has those already in place. We are working with the Housing Department to also move forward with a lien program that would allow us to add the unpaid account to the property tax roll. So there are ways, and we are working with BOE and also the Franchise Tax Board and the LA County tax collector.
Because I have to imagine that would be the most ROI on that would be off the charts compared to all this other stuff.
Right. So in the case of the Housing Department, and I believe there is a representative from that department here, but they have approximately about $15 million every year that goes unpaid. Again, this is an approximate. If we move forward with a direct assessment program, we would be able to close the gap about $5 to $7 million per year.
Anything further, members? I'm really excited about the idea of actually doing this cross-referencing that you're talking about with LA Tax and the business portal. Really very much needed. I've raised before, I think, and I'd like still to be pursued, the idea of finding additional places where we can do such cross-referencing, wherever the city may owe funds to anyone that we can use as an offset, where we can use debt that's owed as an offset. So whether it's somebody that we contract with that we're issuing an RFP to and they're participating in other areas like that where they may not even be actively doing business in the city right now, but we owe them money for prior activity or something. I'd like to find every place possible where we can have offsets of that debt, even if it's aged debt. I don't even know if, maybe if it's past the statute of limitations, if you can still offset without legal recourse, for example.
Right.
But to the extent that we legally can, I certainly want to find every opportunity that we can. I would hate for the city to be in a situation of writing off bad debt with one hand while giving money to a deadbeat from some other source on the other hand.
And one of the challenges we have with collections is that we do operate in a decentralized model. So currently, 5 of about 25 departments that I'm working with use the city's financial management system. The FMS system does have a capability of intercepting those outgoing payments. So say, for instance, if they owe us debt on our AR side of the house, the accounts receivable side of the house, before a check goes out on the accounts payable side of the house, that payment will be intercepted.
So all accounts receivable will be flagged that way?
Correct. But there's only 5 of the 25 that currently use the city's FMS system. We have another 13 departments out there that use their own standalone system, and they are interfacing, but it's only a data dump, if you will, in terms of data, but it's not fully functional in terms of stopping or intercepting a payment, as you're describing.
Okay, good.
But we are working on that, and we'll continue to work on that.
Great. On recommendation number 4, I understand the value of prepayment. Members, I'm going to ask on this one that we hold that recommendation in committee, and the reason is that I'm actually right now working on a more comprehensive approach to the charges that the fire department makes for its fire safety officer watch program with the film industry broadly, because this is an area that is critically important to our economic development strategy for the city right now. And this is one of the chief complaints that the entertainment industry has about excess cost of doing business in the city of Los Angeles as opposed to elsewhere. So since I want to take a broader look at that, prepayment may be an option, but reduction of those fees may also be an option as well. So before we move forward on that with your agreement, members, I'd like to hold that one in committee, and then as we continue to work on it, we'll revisit it in that broader context. And then on item number 5, I have a note here, Mr. Campos, and maybe you understand this better than I, but it does indicate that recommendation number 5 should be amended to state that changes to the Board of Review processes are necessary to comply with ordinance number 182633, which was adopted by the council. Does that
Not all
resonate?
proposed recommendations are associated with that new ordinance that was just passed August 25th. Majority of the recommendations that were proposed on July to the Collections Board of Review are reflecting that ordinance. However, the biggest change or the biggest proposal is to ensure that departments are providing additional data. One of the things that we want to prepare for is to sell the debt and also monetize that debt. In order for us to do that, we need to have accurate information. We need to have all the documentation available so that the Office of Finance can truly value the portfolio and then also get it to the third market. So in terms of amending it that way, not all the proposed changes that were provided to the Collections Board of Review are a reflection of the ordinance, but the proposed recommendations do capture all the ordinance requirements. Did I make sense?
Mr. Ceja, does that make sense to you?
Yes.
Okay, good. That's good enough for me. Well, then, with those changes, then it would be the recommendation to approve recommendations 1, 2, 3, and 6, and 5 as amended, I suppose, and then to hold item recommendation number 4 in committee for further review. And if that's agreeable to everyone, that'll be the action.
With number 2, looking at a focus in the direction on avoiding predatory collection.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Mr. Blumenfield. So with that, that'll be the action of the committee. Mr. Campos, thank you for your continuing excellent work on moving us into the 21st century when it comes to collecting on our accounts receivable.
Thank you for having me here, and I also like to take 5 seconds just to thank the Collections Board of Review, the Office of the City Controllers, and also the Office of Finance for all their work and dedication to the Collections Board of Review process. In addition, the Department of Transportation, Fire, Housing, Building and Safety, Finance, and I know I'm missing one other one, but for all their hard work and collaboration in this report.
All right. Thank you very much. That brings us to item number 7.
Item number 7 is City Clerk and City Administrative Officer reports relative to adding and adjusting positions to support the Business Improvement District Support Program, which is moving to the Economic and Workforce Development Department effective January 1st, 2014. On September 3rd, 2013, the Personnel and Animal Welfare Committee recommended to approve the City Clerk report subject to classification determination by the Civil Service Commission and pay grade determination by the CAO.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Holly Walcott, Interim City Clerk. Back during the budget process for the 2013-14 year, the proposed budget proposed the transfer of the Business Improvement District program from the City Clerk to the new Department of Economic and Workforce Development Department. And at that time, the City Clerk expressed two concerns. One was that the programs not get moved on July 1st because of the assessments due to the county in August, and it didn't seem to be feasible to be moving a program at that time when it was a brand new department. And that the other was we didn't feel that there were sufficient staffing to going to EWDD to manage the program. There are currently 11 positions being transferred, and so the report that we submitted on August 9th outlines the additional positions which we believe would make the program the most successful. Of those, I would like to highlight 3 that I think are the bare minimum, and that is there's currently a Senior 2, Miranda Pastor, who pretty much knows the program better than anybody in the city, and the proposal is to reclassify her position from a Senior Management Analyst 2 to a Chief Management Analyst. And then also due to, for lack of a better term, splitting of the baby, the bid program is short 1 accounting clerk and 1 management analyst. So those are the 3 that we think are most important to keep the program running. This is a $45 million program. There are sufficient funds in the Business Improvement District Trust Fund to fund it for this year. On an ongoing basis, all of the positions in all of the current 11 are only partially funded from recovery fees. So while there would be sufficient funds on an ongoing basis to fund these 3 positions, I still would want to, be perfectly honest and clear that most of the positions are only partially fee supported by the program.
But for the time being, there's sufficient funds available in the trust fund to cover the positions, you believe?
The 3 that I mentioned, yes.
Okay. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Trina Unziker with the Office of the CAO. We were asked by the Personnel Committee to report on this item, and we offered a modified recommendation, which was to take a look at the need for staffing for the bid support program within the context of the 14-15 budget. And the thinking there was, at that point, we'd had an opportunity to take a look at the org charts for both the city clerk and for EWDD, have an opportunity to take a look at the budget descriptions and see how everything fits together. At that point, our thinking was that EWDD will have already transferred the program. That program is to come over January 1 of 2014. And at that point, they might be able to identify some efficiencies within their own department. And so our recommendation was to take a look at the positions, both the reclassifications and the upgrades within the context of the 14-15 budget and its priorities.
And we would be doing that in any event in our ordinary budget review for next fiscal year, right? So the issue is really whether we take an interim action to be able to ensure that the workload of administration of the bids is appropriately met now, pending that review in the 14-15 budget.
That is correct.
Thoughts, members? Mr. Kretz?
Well, I thought in Personnel Committee that it seemed reasonable to make the adjustments so that they were actually able to do their work. So I would recommend that now as well.
So consistent with Ms. Walcott's requests regarding the 3 positions?
Yes.
Mr. Blumenfield?
Is there a way or is there an advantage of doing like a temporary position to get us through to the immediate problem and then it's going to be considered in the overall budget? Or is that a distinction without a difference?
Would these...
You basically would be doing a resolution authority, so it pretty much is a distinction without difference. Because a resolution authority would have to be, as Chairman Corian stated, would have to be vetted during the budget process.
But it's not like by doing it one way, we're assuming more permanent costs and liabilities, and doing it the other way, we're saving it.
Right.
Well, there is a difference. A resolution authority does need to be renewed every budget year, and so it's different than, for lack of a better term, I hate to use the term, but a permanent position, an ordinary position, which nothing's permanent.
Those of us who are ordinary.
But a resolution authority does have to be justified by the department in each budget year. So if this is set up as a resolution authority, then as resolution authorities, then in 6 months they'll need to be back here with a recommendation as to why that should be continued into the next budget year.
Disadvantage.
Whenever.
Well, I think one of the points to consider here is that this recommendation is being made by the city clerk, which is currently where this division is located. If the transfer does take place, resolution position is provided in this other department, it's going to be the other department that's going to be prioritizing its budget and where this unit fits within its priorities. So one thing to consider is the receiving department and where it thinks and what staffing levels that receiving department considers this unit to need in the 14-15 fiscal year.
True. That's still going to happen through the ordinary budget process for the next fiscal year.
Yes.
So it would make sense if we were to proceed with these positions to go ahead with them as resolution authorities and then consider the budget requests by the department, by the receiving department in the ordinary course of budget discussions. Right?
Yes, you could do that.
The only position that would not be a resolution authority would be the reallocation of the senior management analyst to achieve. Because that's already a permanent position.
You're right. A regular position.
Yeah. Ordinary.
Okay, well, Mr. Kretz, was Mr. Kretz's recommendation clear enough as a motion, or do you want to restate it, Mr. Kretz?
Well, I guess that we would
previously.
Well, is it clear enough?
Did you previously heard this in?
Yeah, we heard this in personnel and recommended that we concur with the request from the city clerk's office.
Members, any objection to?
Just for clarification, for the 3, because there's more positions in the report, so for Erica's being able to keep notes.
Yes, for those 3 positions that were discussed.
And then additionally, for clarification, there's also a note on the Personnel Committee report, which indicates that those positions would be subject to review by the City Administrative Officer as to pay grade and Personnel Department as to classification.
Okay.
Thank you.
That makes sense?
Very good. Yes.
Okay. Then without any further objection, that'll be the action of the committee.
Oh, one final clarification. In order for it not to impact the general fund, that the funds be transferred from the bid trust fund in order to pay for the positions.
Do we need to authorize that transfer? Or doesn't that happen within your ordinary authority?
An action would have to be taken at some point.
I think you should authorize it at this point if
Okay.
this
Yeah,
is the
I
intent
agree.
of council.
Okay, yeah, I mean, we'll extend that authorization then as part of the motion as well. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that brings us to item number 8.
Item number 8 is City Administrative Officer Report relative to the U.S. Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance Intellectual Property Enforcement Program Supplemental Grant Award in the amount of $200,000 for use by the City Attorney. And this item was heard in Public Safety Committee on October 25th.
So I'm sorry to keep you waiting this long to accept a grant. I probably should have taken this out of order, but I really wanted to hear from you because enforcement of intellectual property laws and counterfeit abatement is a very significant priority for me, having spent over 2 decades doing exactly that in the private sector. So I'm really eager to hear what we're doing in that regard. Citywide, I know a decade or so ago, then Councilmember Gruhl created a vertically integrated task force to work with intellectual property enforcement. I just kind of would like to get an update on what we're doing with IP enforcement, what we are going to be using this grant to do, and any other suggestions you might have for what we might be able to be doing better and what kind of revenue opportunities that might present or what kind of costs we should be incurring in order to do a better job of it.
Ed Rose with the CAO's office. Basically, the grant totaling $200,000 funds the Mr. Gilligan's position, Deputy City Attorney position, direct salary and fringe benefit costs. And it will enable the City Attorney to continue their counterfeit abatement prosecution program, which targets chronic counterfeiting operations such as jewelry, prescription drugs, CDs, DVDs, things of that nature, which in turn organized crime uses the profits of which to enhance their operations. And we will be pursuing other grants as they come down the pike and working with the City Attorney's office to do that. And without further ado, I can turn over to Kevin. He can give you the details of what their program is all about.
Great.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Councilmember, staff, Deputy City Attorney Kevin Gilligan. Our counterfeit abatement program targets the places where counterfeit goods are repeatedly manufactured, sold, and stored. We're typically filing 17 to 100 actions, Business Professions Code, unlawful competition actions, targeting businesses in the places where the counterfeit problem is not resolved by a typical arrest or search warrant. These are usually chronic locations. They typically have values in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes in the millions of dollars, a retail value of counterfeit goods that have been seized by LAPD, FBI, sheriffs, Homeland Security. We work with a wide variety of local and federal law enforcement to target these locations. So they do the investigation, also private investigators. We also work with the entertainment industry. Cases are investigated and then brought to us typically after there's not always, but oftentimes there's been convictions at the location or people have been arrested, and then we file our unlawful competition actions seeking injunctive relief and civil penalties.
Is it legally possible for our enforcement efforts to receive support from industry? So, the victims here are the legitimate sellers of the goods that are being counterfeited, but it's also their customers. And especially, you mentioned prescription drugs as an example. I mean, people die from counterfeits. There was that young boy in MacArthur Park who was shot to death by some gang member who was doing a collection effort against a counterfeit CD seller. This is not a victimless crime. It's a serious crime in which people, our economy gets sapped, but also people's lives are put at risk. It's easier for a gang member to sell counterfeit CDs than drugs, and you don't do as much time. So I'm just wondering if there's a way that we can reach out to industry to support your efforts, or if we just simply have to rely on them to use their private civil actions and investigations to support your efforts in the abatement and on the criminal side.
Well, first, let me say thank you very much for pointing that out, that it's not a victimless crime. It is very serious. It is a multi-billion-dollar problem worldwide, and Los Angeles Economic Development Corporation just studied in 2005 and found, I don't recall the exact number, but I want to say it was in the neighborhood of around $5 billion to lost LA economy in 2005. So it is a very serious problem, and that's a continuing education process for that we have to do for judges and law enforcement and citizens to educate them about that problem. You hit it the nail on the head. As far as whether or not private industry can pay for that, I believe that there is someone in our office who's taking a look at that right now to make sure that there's no ethical problems with that. That would be, I think, the primary concern. Is there any appearance of impropriety?
Right.
And as a lawyer, we have to avoid the appearance of impropriety in the cases. So that's something we'll be looking at, and I could try to get some further information and
I'd
have
appreciate
a report back. Would you like that to yourself, Councilmember?
That would be fine, and then we'll see if it needs to come back before committee, but I'd certainly like to talk to you about that and see how we can support your efforts.
Thank you, because I think I am the only person in Los Angeles County, one of the few in the state and the country, as a matter of fact, who's handling counterfeit abatement actions. There's very few places that are doing it, and so we're out in front on that, and we have a long history of doing abatements, narcotic abatements, vice abatements, in the city attorney's office, and this is a progression of that.
You're the only person doing it, and you're doing it in the counterfeit capital of the United States, the gateway of counterfeits from Asia that come through Los Angeles to feed the habit of the rest of the country. And so you're doing incredible work in just holding back the flood. So thank you for that. Anything further?
We've already heard it in public safety.
Okay. No. All right. So it'll be the action of the committee to approve the report and gratefully accept the grant. Thank you. That brings us to item number 9.
Item number 9 is Board of Police Commissioners and City Administrative Officer reports relative to Los Angeles Police Department's contract with Raytheon to implement Phase 2 of the digital in-car video system for an amount not to exceed $7.9 million. Public Safety heard this item on October 25th with recommendations directing LAPD with assistance of CAO to report relative to the cost to implement the in-car video citywide and with an estimate of ongoing costs to operate and maintain the system thereafter.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. You want us to jump in? I know it's...
Yeah, just jump right in. You've waited this long. I'm sure you're ready to roll.
All right. Anne Marie Sauer with the CAO, and I have my good friends from the police department here. And the department is requesting authority to execute a contract with Raytheon to implement Phase 2 of in-car video in Operations Central Bureau for an amount not to exceed approximately $7.9 million. It will be a 5-year contract that will begin upon contract execution and end 5 years after system acceptance by the police department. It will be installed in 381 vehicles, and the contract also covers installation of supporting infrastructure, system testing, and training. We'll jump into the financing piece. The current year budget included about $2.5 million in the CAP Finance Administration Fund for debt service for Phase 2. And in order to reduce the overall debt service obligation, we're recommending a combination of using that money as cash, plus this just in, the Police Foundation is donating $1 million for this project. So we're actually going to be able to use the $2.5 million from CAP Finance and the $1 million from the foundation. And then the balance will be MICLA commercial paper, which will be the short-term debt. So we'll end up issuing approximately $4.4 million in MICLA as a result of using the cash first. And we're estimating the debt service payments, the total cost of the project, including debt service now with the additional cash from the foundation, to be about just over 7.9, about $7.985 million.
Is the cost of Phase 2?
Yes.
Okay. And what was the cost of Phase 1?
$5.5 million.
And Phase 1 was paid for from through the general fund?
Yes. I believe
So
so.
what is the rationale for treating the payment method of Phase 2 differently than Phase 1, using short-term?
Right. At this point, in terms of cash, this was sort of the best option. If we had cash available, obviously it would be ideal if we could just pay for it. The thinking is that the MICLA would be issued, the commercial paper, on January 1st, and it would become, the first payment would be due July 1st of next year. And one option we're going to look at as part of the budget is just basically paying it off with some one-time funding, if that's available. So that is contemplated at this point. The other situation related to this is that there had been money set aside for cap finance in the last two budget years, but unfortunately, because of the delays in getting the Phase 2 off the ground and getting the contract moving, those funds reverted. So as part of the budget discussions for the next few years, we're going to have to basically set aside the money for those payments if we don't have cash come the first of the year, first of the next fiscal year. So sort of in the interest of putting it all out there. The other piece is, should the department decide, obviously there's the will, I think, to go ahead and roll out the in-car video citywide. So that would also be something we could do as part of this contract. The department would have to come back and have it amended, and we'd also have to identify funding for those additional phases, which that information was requested by the Public Safety Committee to be reported here. So in terms of the ongoing costs, it's estimated that Valley Bureau, which would be next, would be about $9.5 million, and that would be to install the system in about 477 vehicles. And West Bureau would be just over $7 million, and that would be for 366 vehicles. So those would be, again, additional costs moving forward, plus the ongoing costs, the annual replacement parts, which are needed for each bureau, basically after that bureau's been live for a year. That's going to be about $350,000. And then the annual extended maintenance. So the contract requires this 5-year warranty. So once we get beyond that, it would be about another $300,000 per year per bureau. So there are additional.
And what is the life expectancy of these systems?
So Sergeant Dan Gomez from Technology Bureau. So they're a minimum of 5 years. I mean, our current operating system was first purchased in 2006, still fully functional in South Bureau today.
And that's 5 years on our maintenance. Their shelf life is expected to last much longer than that. But we asked for a 5-year maintenance agreement in this contract. We're able to extend maintenance beyond the 5 years.
Okay. There's a maintenance agreement for 5 years?
Correct.
And
I apologize, Maggie Goodrich, Chief Information Officer for LAPD. Yes, in the contract before you for the Phase 2 rollout in Central Bureau, there's 5 years of maintenance and warranty included in that.
Okay, so will that 5-year maintenance package be included in all of the phases?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So then we shouldn't have any maintenance costs other than something that's out of warranty for some.
Correct. After the 5 years is up in each bureau, then we would seek funding for extended maintenance. Actually, the initial 5 years is coming up for the Phase 1 implementation in South Bureau, and so we'll be requesting an additional $300,000 in next fiscal year's budget to cover extended maintenance.
I see. Okay. Mr. Blumenfield.
So what does it cost per unit, per car?
So there are multiple costs. There's the units in the vehicle. There's also the central servers in each station, and then there is central storage also in City Hall East. Are you looking for just the cost for the camera itself and cameras themselves in the vehicle, or
take the total cost divided by the number of cameras? What does that give us?
It's approximately just under $8,000 per vehicle to do. When you look at all the total costs.
Per vehicle per year? Or upfront for the first?
Upfront. The way I've calculated that number is looking at the entire contract and basically, as you suggested, dividing it through, looking at all the applicable costs per car, and then it comes out to about $8,000 per vehicle.
And then that's for the life of the
that covers the 5 year?
That covers the 5 year period.
5 years. So $8,000 per vehicle over a 5-year period.
Correct.
And are other cities doing it? Does that compare in price to the way other cities have done it? Or are we getting a better deal?
Yeah, when you look at the numbers because we buy in such volume, then we are at the upper end of the competitive level. I haven't seen a contract of this size be as competitive as what we've negotiated to this point for this particular product.
Great. Have we seen, has there been any way, and I love the idea of the cameras in there, I'm just trying to understand how it all rolls out. Have we seen liability savings? Is there a way to quantify that? this point?
So what we've been able to calculate is looking at our complaint investigations. We haven't necessarily gotten to the point where we can calculate any sort of claims or lawsuits. But as far as complaints, for years 2011, 2012, we had 226 complaints that were actually impacted by in-car video being captured. And we were able to find 92% of those either exonerated or unfounded was the final disposition of the complaint against the officer as a result of the video being captured.
Versus what's the control on that for all the other departments? Or the everywhere outside of Central?
I don't have that number off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
It would be a useful exercise, I think, to go, assuming that, I want to see it in the Valley, but all over the city, that this pencils out the way it sounds like it does. It would be a useful exercise to know, what those, if it's 92% versus 50%, and if the average claimant is X, these things you might have a very strong case to roll it out citywide faster,
right?
Based on cost savings. But those are, it's hard to quantify.
I believe we have a placeholder in full council for Wednesday if this should be approved today, so I could certainly report those numbers on Wednesday in full council.
Okay. I can. Mr. Englander?
Yeah. And we heard this, and we've been working on this for a long time in public safety, asking all those questions. Here it was requested that it become the budget, since it's a budget item as well. But from a public safety perspective, and putting on that hat as the chair of public safety, we've asked beyond the multitude of questions on everything you can fathom on these systems, from officer perspective as well as bringing in the Police Protective League and looking at policies and practices and data retention and technologies. Sergeant Gomez, who's by far the best law enforcement technologist, at least certainly west of the Mississippi, depending on who you talk to in New York, but it's just done a phenomenal job. We've explored and are moving forward with on-officer cameras, on-body cameras to enhance the system. We're looking at the liability we pay out annually, and if we can capture even a portion of that, it pays for itself. But, the critical thing is if you look at what's happening right now with in-car video and on-officer video nationally, LA is moving forward and under the chief's direction. And so I give a lot of credit to the chief, Charlie Beck, for moving in this direction. And if you look at some of the battles going on in New York, they're trying to push away from it. Here we are embracing technology, and which is very fascinating. And a lot of other cities who are trying to catch up to what we're even discussing. And so from a public safety perspective, I support where the chief is going with this.
Mr. Kress?
Any reason why we should be concerned about using MICLA funding for some of this?
This is different from what we always talk about as MICLA. This is short-term MICLA, which is commercial paper, and it's different than when we've used regular MICLA, I guess. I'm going to let the expert explain it, which requires the useful life.
Typically, for under our MICLA policy, we need, and if you want to finance capital equipment, it needs to be at minimum 6 years of a useful life. That is because we use MICLA CP as an interim financing tool. So we would issue CP to acquire the equipment, and then we'll take that commercial paper debt, the short-term debt, convert it into long-term. In this case, we are not converting the debt into a long-term debt. The market standard is that they would like to see equipment that's at least 6 years or more. But because we're going to pay off the debt in commercial paper, we're never going to the market essentially into long-term debt. So there is no issue regarding the capital equipment itself.
Thank you.
I know that Mr. Englander and the Public Safety Committee have looked at this in great depth, and I think this is expensive, obviously. It's a lot of money to spend for this system citywide. But I can see that there could be also substantial offsetting savings, especially when it comes to potential liability. Because I, for one, am very tired of paying out lawsuit settlements because somebody said that somebody did something wrong, and then it turns out we don't have the evidence to demonstrate that, in fact, somebody didn't do anything wrong. And I think, I believe that there's going to be a significant savings that come from a system like this, but also, in those cases where somebody believes there has been some misconduct, if the video demonstrates that that was the case, then so be it. That's important for us to know as well, so that the department can manage those situations appropriately. There's a lot of public safety benefits that I think can come from this. So I appreciate the fact that we're moving into the 21st century with some of these techniques. I am a little concerned about just this change in the financing mechanism from phase one. And I think for consistency's sake, my preference would be to maintain the same way that we purchased phase one when we purchase phase two. So, and I don't know whether that, you explained sort of the cash flow situation. I'm not sure that I'm confident that at least I understand that has, completely been explored. So what I'd like to do is recommend that we approve the recommendation to award the contract for the total amount for phase two of the LAPD's in-car video program move forward. But I would like to, and I'd also like to concur with Public Safety Committee's request to instruct the CAO to report on the total cost of implementing the in-car video system. I appreciate, that we just got sort of that report, but I think having a clear view of the road ahead for a citywide rollout and ongoing costs of implementation, I'd like to see come back to this committee as well. And then I'd like to get a report back from the CAO's office attempting to identify the remaining funding necessary to supplement the $2.5 million that's already included in the 13-14 budget from sources other than debt financing. And so I'd like to have that come back as well for further consideration. But in any event, we should approve the award of the contract and move forward with phase two. So you said there's a placeholder for Wednesday.
Yes. That's my understanding. I have not seen it.
So I wonder if we can move forward on Wednesday with the award of the contract and have a report back separate from that, identifying the potential alternative sources of paying for that contract. That needn't necessarily be included in that Wednesday vote, right?
No. Well, I think the report, actually, in the CAO's report, mentions that they're going to issue the MICLA paper in January. Is that what they're shooting for?
And that would be the last.
So what would be the
cash.
So what would be the time frame by which what would be our drop dead date for making that decision about whether to go out to get MICLA finance?
In MICLA commercial paper, it's very flexible. So I would just need maybe a week in advance notice to issue the paper.
Okay.
And now that we have the $1 million from the foundation, that may
which is terrific.
Our time frame.
And I did want to highlight that because that was information that was not available at the time that this was in public safety, but
Yeah,
the Police Foundation did come forward with $1 million toward phase two.
Yeah, for which we are grateful, and that's really good news. So, when is the report due back to public safety on the
It's not.
system?
It was instructed to come here.
It was actually what we provided at the beginning, the cost for the next two bureaus and then the ongoing costs. That was what we provided.
Oh, okay. That was all that public safety had requested?
Yeah,
okay.
And that to come back here. But there's sufficient funds beyond the $1 million as well, because you weren't looking at financing the entire system. There was another
2.5.
No, there's 2.5 already.
You now have got 3.5.
Right.
Yeah.
And that pushes back.
We weren't looking at putting out MICLA until January, and you can
Right.
do that in a week's time. So there's time
So
to meet your request.
why don't
as
we
the
get a
chair.
30-day report back then on alternative funding that wouldn't involve debt financing, and
Hold
we
that
can make that
portion back
consideration.
until we can make that determination.
Yeah, so we can advance the contract, and then with regard to the funding source, we'll hear that back here in 30 days. Okay?
Thank you.
All right. Is that clear enough? Okay, very good. Mr. Seha, anything further?
No, that concludes the agenda.
If we could also take a moment to thank Maggie, too. She's done an incredible amount of work on this on behalf of the department. So
And this is
phenomenal.
going to be a big step forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And with that, we are, is there any further public comment? Seeing none, we are adjourned.